My name is Antonio Fortunato and I work at the European Astronaut Center as Deputy Team Lead for Crew Operations. Now, one way we can describe the activities that are done on the space station and the type of training that astronauts must undergo to go to the space station is to actually select a standard mission and to describe this mission from the point of view of a European astronaut from beginning to end. So from the selection of the astronaut for the mission up to the end of the post-flight. Now, when I speak about a standard mission, I mean a mission after the station assembly was declared complete. Before that date, there were a number of ESA missions to the ISS, but those were always very special missions operating in very specific conditions that were dictated by the need of assembling the station. After the assembly was complete, we could finally focus on the utilization of the station. And the missions that serve full utilization of the stations are very different from what was flown in the past. So what does a standard mission look like? Well, normally we are talking about a 6-month flight. We're talking about a flight that spans across 2 increments, where an increment is defined as the period of time spanning between 2 subsequent undockings of a Soyuz vehicle. And obviously, after the station assembly was declared complete, we knew that we would operate the station likely at least up to 2020. And so we knew how many of those long-duration missions, as they are called, we would have to fly. We also knew how much each international partner has contributed to the station and the program. So we knew how many missions each international partner would be assigned in those rough first 10 years of full utilization of the space station. And once we knew when a flight was assigned to which agency, then each agency has the freedom to choose which astronaut to fly. Of course, this is not something that is done completely independent. There is a multilateral crew operations panel that blesses the assignment of astronauts to ISS increments, but by and large, it is the single space agencies that decide which astronaut will fly in their own increments. Now, the announcement of which astronaut flies in each increment is generally done 2 years and 9 months before the predicted launch. And that is because in the current approach for training, what is called the single flow to launch, a 6-month mission to the ISS requires 2.5 years of training. And since the rule is that the assignment of an astronaut cannot come later than 3 months before the beginning of training, you understand that when you put together the 6 months of the mission plus 2.5 years plus the 3 months before training begins plus the 6 months of post-flight, you understand that the involvement of an astronaut in a mission is about 4 years, which is actually a big difference from what it used to be in the past, for instance, for shuttle flights. Shuttle flights were usually 10 to 15 days in duration, and a typical training for a flight wouldn't last more than 1 year, which actually meant that involvement for any specific mission was much less, and it also meant that in a career of an astronaut, a certain number of flights could be predicted. This is no longer the case. Now we have long-duration missions, and we have only limited seats on the Soyuz vehicle, which is currently the only way we can bring astronauts up and down from the space station. So the number of flight opportunities is greatly reduced from what we had in the past. Now, speaking about training, as everything else in the ISS program, training is a multinational endeavor. We have a number of international partners working on the ISS program, And obviously, each international partner delivers a specific piece of astronaut training that is related to areas of their responsibility. A big part of astronaut training is spent in Houston at the Johnson Space Center. At the Johnson Space Center, astronauts generally spend 38 weeks out of 2 years and a half of training, which accounts for about 40% of their training time. What is covered at JSC is obviously training on the United States on-orbit segment systems. You know that the space station is divided formally in two segments, the Russian on-orbit segment and the United States on-orbit segment. And the training for the system, the life support system, the thermal control system, the power system of the US part of the space station is delivered in Houston. And in Houston, obviously, also the science on the NASA side is delivered. In addition, there are two important areas that are trained in Houston. The first one is EMU-EVA. Now, EMUs are the extravehicular mobility units, and those are the suits that are used by NASA to perform their own extravehicular activities. Now, those are trained in a special laboratory that's called the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory. It is actually close to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and you can see in this picture is astronaut Alexander Gerst while it is pulled out of this huge pool after a training session on EMU-EVA. Also, what is extremely important that is trained in Houston are the operations of the Canadarm, the Space Station Robotic Manipulator System. Now, the Canadarm is an extremely important system because it allows a number of cargo vehicles to berth to the space station. If you think about Sinus, if you think about Dragon, if you think about HTV, all those vehicles cannot dock autonomously to the ISS as the Progress and ATV vehicles can, but they need to be captured and taken to a position where they can actually connect to the ISS by the robotic arm. So to keep an astronaut corps that is properly trained on the operations of the robotic arm is one of the main goals in ISS operations. Also, the robotic arm is important because it delivers support for EVA. Sometimes EVAs require the exchange, for instance, of big pieces of equipment that are located outside. Those exchanges can be done, for instance, by cruising EVA, but cruising EVA need the support of the robotic arm to move those boxes from the location where they are, for instance, temporarily stowed to the location where they are actually needed. Now, beside the training in the United States, there is also a big chunk of training that is delivered at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City near Moscow. Training at GCTC normally lasts 42 weeks, which actually represents 44% of an astronaut training flow. Now, the numbers that I'm mentioning here are not fixed numbers. Not all the astronauts undergo the same amount of training. Not all the astronauts undergo the same type of training. So obviously, there might be a difference of several weeks in specific cases. But those numbers give you a rough overview of what would be the normal effort for a European astronaut. Now, of those 42 weeks at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center, a lot of time is dedicated actually to Soyuz training. Depending on the role that the astronaut has in the Soyuz, this training can be more or less long. The big difference is if an astronaut is assigned as a board engineer 1 or as a board engineer 2. The board engineer 1 or left seater is the one with a lot of responsibility, for instance, in valve operations during the dynamic phases of Soyuz flights, and it is also the member of the Soyuz crew that more directly helps the Soyuz commander, which is always a Russian cosmonaut. The right seater, on the other hand, has very limited responsibility, and as a matter of fact, the right seat is generally always the seat that is given to the space tourist when there is a space tourist flying on the ISS. Now, of course, apart from Soyuz operations, and you see here a nice picture of Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti in front of the Soyuz simulator in Star City. There is also training about the operations of the systems on the Russian segment and the Russian science that is performed on board. Also, Russia has its own capability for extravehicular activities. So if an astronaut will be assigned later on in the flight to perform an EVA with the Russian Orlan spacesuit, then this astronaut will be trained in GCTC on Orlan operations. And as in Houston, there is a big pool with a mock-up of the space station submerged. A similar situation is actually true in Star City. And of course, winter survival training is an important part of the training that's delivered in Russia. Normally, the Soyuz vehicle lands in Kazakhstan in a location that can be reached by search and rescue forces very quickly. But what can also happen is that the crew has to land in a completely different location, and they might have to survive on their own for a very long time, or at least till the search and rescue forces can reach them on location. This is not a theoretical situation, it actually happened in the history of Soyuz operations. Now, of course, 40% of training performed in the US, 44% of training performed in Russia. This doesn't really leave a lot for the training performed in Europe and in Japan. Normally, a European astronaut spends about 9 weeks training in Europe. This is about 10% of the total training time. And what is trained in Europe at the European Astronaut Center in Cologne are Columbus systems, Columbus payloads, so the European science that they will perform while on the ISS, and also up to now ATV operations. The ATV operations training actually will be soon terminated, is already finished as a matter of fact, because the last ATV, ATV-5, is currently docked to the ISS, and all the crews who needed to be trained on ATV have been trained. So this is an activity that will not be happening anymore in the European part of the training. Last but not least, the crew spends about 6 weeks in training in Japan, and the training is delivered at the Space Station Integration and Promotion Center in Tsukuba. This amounts to about 6% of the training, and the training obviously revolves on the systems and on the payloads of the Japanese module. One interesting feature of the Japanese Kibo module is actually its airlock and robotic manipulator. This is actually a unique capability for the Japanese module, and basically it allows to bring a payload on one cargo vehicle, to put it in the Japanese airlock, then to close the airlock, to open it on the other side, and from that, the Japanese robotic arm can actually pick up a payload and bring it outside, either to the external platform of the Japanese module, or the robotic arm itself can actually be used to perform other operations, like, for instance, the release of CubeSats. So training of this Japanese robotic arm is also something that is generally performed in Tsukuba, and you see in the picture here Belgian astronaut Frank de Wien and the Dutch astronaut André Kuipers training on the operations of the Japanese robotic manipulator. Now, 2.5 years of training. For European astronauts, you must have realized also a lot of time away from their family. Finally comes the time of the launch. The launch campaign is usually about 15 days. The astronauts prepare their last activities for the flight. There are a lot of traditions, especially related to Soyuz flights. You might have heard some of them. One of the most well-known is the fact that every crew on a Soyuz flight, the evening before launch, watches the old Soviet movie, The White Sun of the Desert. Now, the legend goes that cosmonauts and astronauts have to watch this movie because this is the movie that Gagarin watched before his flight to space. Well, this is actually not quite accurate. If you look at the year of release of the movie, you realize that the movie was actually released in the early 70s. And Gagarin flew, as you all very well know, on the 12th of April of 1961. So he couldn't have possibly watched that movie. The reality is that this is the movie that was watched by the crew that first flew to space on a Soyuz vehicle after the accident of Soyuz 11. This was the first successful flight after 3 Russian cosmonauts actually lost their lives on their way back from the space station Salyut 1. And ever since, as a sign of good luck, all cosmonaut crews have watched this movie. Now, a Soyuz launch in its powered phase lasts about 9 minutes, and then it takes another 6 hours before the astronauts and cosmonauts actually can dock to the International Space Station. The situation used to be slightly different in the past. For many years, the crews had to wait 48 hours in the Soyuz vehicle before they could actually dock to the ISS. And this wasn't exactly a very comfortable situation because the ISS is a small, cramped vehicle, and to spend 48 hours in it is, of course, much worse than to spend only 6 hours in there. In any case, now we have a 6-hour rendezvous or 4-orbit rendezvous, as it is commonly known. That means that basically the same day of the launch, the crew can already arrive on the International Space Station. And here you can see a wonderful picture of a Soyuz vehicle on its way to dock with the ISS. Actually, I would like to spend here a couple of words on the Soyuz. The Soyuz is in many ways a wonder of technology. It was first launched in 1967. Obviously, it was updated in its systems many times over the years. It is an incredibly efficient and an incredibly resilient system. It is very fault tolerant, and throughout history has proven time and again that a number of things can happen to it. It will still ensure as much as possible the safety of the crew.